On today's episode, we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coming right up. And what is up, everyone? You're listening to the Gridiron Fantasy Football Podcast for Monday, November 9th, 2020. And I'm Chip, I'm your host, and thank you so much for listening today. If you're a new listener, thank you so much for joining us as well. If you'd like to share our podcast, you can find us over on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. If you'd like to watch us, you can watch us over on YouTube at Gridiron Fantasy Football. So, please hit subscribe, hit the bell, so you don't miss any more episodes and help support the show. But on today's episode, we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you all of my Week 9 reactions, plus all the fantasy studs for Week 9. But before we get into that, let's talk about some of the news that took place on Monday. And to start off with the Carolina Panthers, it looks like Christian McCaffrey is dealing with another injury. We all know he just came back from a high ankle sprain. It looks like on the last drive of the game yesterday against the Chiefs, he is dealing with a shoulder injury. So it looks like the reports are saying that he has a AC joint sprain, which is obviously in your shoulder. And then he's considered day-to-day based on what the head coach said this morning. So he could play Week 10. There's a likely chance that he won't play, but something to monitor once he gets his additional tests done to see the severity of his shoulder. Then obviously that will determine what he does based on Week 10 status, but also how he practices through the week. Always pay attention to the practice reports to determine what his participation is, just in case. So if you have Mike Davis, if you're a Christian McCaffrey owner and you own Mike Davis, hopefully you kept on to Mike Davis for some insurance, just so something like this happens, you have somebody to plug right in rather than have to go buy on Fab Mike Davis again. So hopefully, there was a lot of people who dropped Mike Davis. Those people are regretting that right now if you're a Christian McCaffrey owner. So just something to monitor throughout the week. And then going on to Washington, their quarterback Kyle Allen fractured his ankle yesterday when he was getting tackled. Now, the ankle fracture is not as bad as Dak Prescott's. However, it still going to require surgery. The fracture was not as bad. He still dislocated his ankle and fractured his ankle and requires surgery. He will be out for the rest of this season. But it looks like he will, Alex Smith will be the starting going forward. That's what Ron Rivera has indicated so far this morning, is that Alex Smith will be the Week 10 starter over Dwayne Haskins. And then going on to the Chicago Bears and the Houston Texans, both David Montgomery and David Johnson are in the concussion protocol, so that their stats will be monitored throughout the week. They still have a good chance to play on Sunday. However, it all depends on how they go through this protocol, how quickly they're able to hit all the milestones they need to get to play and practice for the week. But obviously, the later the week goes on and the limitations they have in practice will give us a better indication if they're going to play on Sunday. But if you're a David Montgomery owner or a David Johnson owner, you have to look just in case to pivot to a backup or pick up somebody on free agency. And then good news out of Cleveland. So Nick Chubb should be practicing this week. He should return to Week 10. I think this was the plan all along. He was dealing with a knee sprain. He based on the timetable of the knee sprain, it lined up more to him returning after the bye week than before the bye week. So you wanted that extra week to get healthy, recover, get all the rehab he needed to get in. So it looks like he's good to go for Week 10. So that's good news if you're a Nick Chubb owner. But that's all the news for today, Monday. And then now going on to my favorite segment on Mondays is the top plays based on next-gen stats. So to start off, on the fastest ball carrier for Week 9 was Curtis Samuel. His top speed was 21.5 miles per hour on his 14-yard TD reception. Now, this is a guy that we were unsure about his involvement once Christian McCaffrey came back, but it looks like they're going to implement him a little bit more into the offense, which does hurt. If you saw what happened yesterday to Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore, it definitely really hurt their value. But now with Christian McCaffrey kind of questionable for Week 10, how does that change everyone's fantasy outlook on those guys? But as of right now, Curtis Samuel he was the fastest ball carrier for Week 9. And then the longest play, this was a very interesting play because it netted 0 yards. But C.J. Goodwin of the Dallas Cowboys, he had to run 155.4 yards on his punt return that netted 0 yards. Now, the reason why it netted 0 yards was because there was a penalty. But if you watch the play, it was pretty funny. He was once they punted the ball away, he was running down the sideline away from the ball where the ball got kicked. and he kind of like limped up and like was grabbing his hamstring, he hurt his hamstring, so he was trying to take himself out of the play. And you see him run to the other side of the field, and you see him get the ball thrown to his side of the field, lateral to him, and he ran straight down the sideline. Pretty clever, but unfortunately a penalty had negated all that, so he ran all those yards for no gain. And then going to the improbable completion, so this goes to Ryan Tannehill to A.J. Brown on their 40-yard reception. He had a completion probability percentage of 15.2%, so that was the lowest probability this week. And then going to the remarkable rushes, that goes to Dalvin Cook. He had a 70-yard rushing touchdown that was only expected to get 7 yards, so he netted 63 yards over expected. So Dalvin Cook continues to be on fire right now, 2 weeks in a row since his injury that he's just torn it up. So Dalvin Cook is just in his zone right now, which is good. And then going on to the fastest sack for Week 9, that goes to Buffalo Bills linebacker A.J. Klein. He sacked Russell Wilson in 2.47 seconds. So great top plays for this week. I love doing this segment just because it gives people that don't really get talked about a lot some recognition. So I always love this segment. But now going on to my reactions to Week 9, and I'm going to start off with the Sunday Night Football game because if you all listen to the podcast, you know I'm a Bucs fan. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see the Bucs autographed jerseys behind me. But it is frustrating to see a team that's so talented just completely get their asses handed to them last night. It was so frustrating to watch as a fan. If you're a Saints fan, kudos to you guys. Just completely just slapped us in the face. I mean, it was awful. But it was I feel like I was watching an episode of Oprah because it was, you get a touchdown, you get a touchdown, you get a touchdown. They could not stop Drew Brees from throwing touchdown passes. And it was very frustrating to watch. Drew Brees for me this week he was kind of depending on if Michael Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders play, he was a guy that I was fading him from starting. But if you're in a 2-quarterback league, you're starting Drew Brees. So if you played him, you're great. But I was not expecting, based on how the Bucs just shut down Aaron Rodgers, the Bucs defense overall has been pretty stout. And you see what Drew Brees did, just completely just picked them apart. He had 4 touchdown passes. Alvin Kamara, he didn't have the game that Alvin Kamara usually has. I mean, obviously, this was his lowest PPR total from a fantasy standpoint that he's had all year. He did score, so that was good, but he wasn't getting the targets. I think he only had it was 60 or 40 yards rushing, so it was not a good overall outing for Alvin Kamara, but he didn't need to do anything because Drew Brees was on fire last night. Michael Thomas, he came back. He was 5 for 51, so a pretty quiet comeback for Michael Thomas. Emmanuel Sanders scored, obviously, so just overall, it was just a bad game plan. I don't know what the Bucs were doing. I have no idea if the Bucs were. I mean, they had Antonio Brown back, so Tom Brady had 3 turnovers. He had 3 interceptions. They only rushed the ball 5 times all night, which is by far the least amount of rushing attempts I think in 100 years. And one of those rushes was Blake Galbert coming in to kneel the ball down. They considered that as a rush. So they had 4 going into that kneel down. Just a bad game. I mean, Gronk had 1 catch for 2 yards. AB, he had 5 targets. He was 3 for 31. So, there was no, I don't know. It just was not a good outing for the Bucs offense. I mean, you have all these weapons. You expect them to do something, considerably good against this defense with all the weapons you have, and they just completely got knocked in the mouth. So, just an overall bad game. So, obviously the Saints won this game 38-3. This game was over by halftime. It was 31-0 at halftime. And it's just an overall bad game for the Bucs. And if they really want to be playoff contention or beat playoff teams, they need to not look like that. I mean, they had a bad game against the Raiders or the Bears. They come out, they lose to the Saints the first game, they lost to the Bears, and they lost to the Saints again. I mean, that can't happen if you're going to try to make a Super Bowl push or a playoff push. You can't lose to teams like that. You have to be competitive, and that was just a bad game overall for the Tampa Bay Bucs. So hopefully they turn around against the Panthers this week. All right, rant over. Okay, now going on to the Falcons versus the Broncos. Falcons were able to hold on to this lead. They won 34-27. Drew Lock, he was a streamer of mine this week, had a very good game. He had 313 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he added another 7 rushes for 47 yards. So Drew Lock, the Falcons are pretty giving on the defense when it comes to quarterback play. So they're one of the teams that give up the most points to the quarterback position. So Drew Lock overall was a good play. He did well. Matt Ryan, another good game for Matt Ryan. Everything changed with Julio Jones in the lineup. He had 3 touchdown passes. Todd Gurley, he had 19 rushes, but only 53 yards rushing. So he had a touchdown. But this is not the Todd Gurley that we're used to seeing. Just 2.8 yards per carry. Not very good from him. But on the receiving side of everything, Jerry Jeudy, very good game. 7 catches for 125 yards and a touchdown. He had 14 targets. Big game from him. That was if you watch his route running, Jerry Jeudy is very, very good at route running. And just now we know this is the Falcons defense. We know that we don't see this on an every game basis, but I'm pretty excited about what Jerry Jeudy can do in this league going forward. And then on the Atlanta side of the ball, I'm not going to pronounce his name right, but I think it's Olamide Zaccheaus. I think that's how you say his name. He had 4 receptions for 103 yards and a touchdown. So he led all Falcons with receiving. Hayden Hurst, he had a good game for PPR formats. He had 7 receptions for 62 yards. He had 8 targets. Julio Jones had 7 targets. He was 5 for 54 and a touchdown. So overall, the main guys that you're playing in fantasy did decent enough for you. So can't be really mad about the outcomes of that game when it comes to fantasy. And then going on to, this is another ugly game, the Seahawks versus the Bills. I mean, the Bills are a good defense, but Seattle has been unstoppable on offense. Russell Wilson has been just, cooking all year. And this is an East Coast, this is a team that travels from the West Coast to the East Coast and has a 10 o'clock game based on our time. So on the West Coast, obviously, all the early games for us are 10 o'clock in the morning. So body clock, travel, all that stuff, it matters. And they were just out of sync the whole game. So they lost this game to Buffalo 44-34. But Russell Wilson had a lot of turnovers. He had a decent outing fantasy-wise because he had touchdowns. But just overall, just not a good game. Josh Allen, one of the top fantasy quarterbacks for this week, had 3 touchdowns. He had another 7 rushes for 14 yards and a touchdown, so 4 total touchdowns. So Josh Allen continues to do well. Now, this was against a very giving Seahawks defense, so just to put it in context. But overall, a good fantasy outing for Josh Allen. Now, when it comes to the rushing, Seattle. So this was a couple questions I had this week about if DJ Dallas was worth to start. And throughout the week, I was like, yeah, if DJ Dallas is the starter, it should be good for fantasy owners because of what he did last week. I mean, if Chris Carson was out again, if Carlos Hyde was out again, it makes sense that DJ Dallas would be the guy you would start. However, as the week progressed, Pete Carroll came out and said, well, they had activated Alex Collins from the practice squad, and then Travis Homer was healthier. So it's like, okay, well, it looked good for DJ Dallas to take the workload. However, if you look at what happened, the breakdown of the rushes, it was DJ Dallas had 7 carries, Travis Homer had 6, and then, Alex Collins had 2, so it wasn't really much out of that. But DJ Dallas still did have a touchdown. So, it didn't kill you in fantasy this week, but it wasn't like what he did last week. We had over 20 PPR points because of his 2 touchdowns. So, very interesting breakdown from there based on what we saw last week. And then for Buffalo, Zach Moss, he didn't have a good game at all. He had 9 carries for 18 yards and a touchdown. But if you look at based on Zach Moss and Devin Singletary had 2 carries. So not good for Devin Singletary. It looks like Zach Moss has become that starter. I think that's the role that they're leaning towards, which I kind of said for the last few weeks that was kind of trending that way. So Zach Moss looks like he is now the starter. Now, that's not definite, just based on you look at the carries and the workload, he got the majority of the carries. And then from a receiving standpoint, DK Metcalf had a good game, 7 for 108 and a touchdown. Stephon Diggs was 9 for 118. John Brown was 8 for 99, so good for those 2 guys. They had, Diggs had 12 targets, Brown had 11 targets, so big games from those guys. Then you look at like Cole Beasley, because a lot of people play Cole Beasley in the flex because obviously not knowing exactly John Brown's stats, how he's going to be involved, because the last couple of weeks he hasn't been doing well fantasy-wise. But, Cole Beasley was 3 for 39, so he only had 3 targets. So just not a overall good game for Cole Beasley if you played him in the flex. Now going on to the Tennessee Titans versus the Bears. This game was kind of out of reach until later on in the game where the Chicago Bears scored 17 points in the 4th quarter. So the Titans still won 24-17. But just overall, I mean, it was one of those defensive games where, Ryan Tannehill still had 2 touchdowns. Derrick Henry had a very quiet game. He only had 68 yards rushing. But this game, from a fantasy standpoint, just didn't bring you a lot. So I would say the 2 bright spots of this game was A.J. Brown. He was 4 for 101 in the touchdown, which I was actually surprised about this because the Bears are so good, defending the pass, that I was not sure that he was going to get a game like this. So he did well. Jonnu Smith, he was 2 for 32 in a touchdown, so not bad from him. Allen Robinson, he was 7 for 81. So overall, this game was pretty kind of borderline when it comes to your fantasy starters. But David Montgomery, he had 14 carries for 30 yards. He left the game early with a concussion. So, what was interesting to me about this, Corey Davis was a guy that people were picking up on the waiver wire the last few weeks, and he was 0 for 0 on 3 targets. So it was my bad too, because I thought Corey Davis was going to actually do something well, because I felt like Kyle Fuller of the Bears was going to shut down A.J. Brown, and I felt like Corey Davis would be the guy that would benefit from that, but he was a non-factor, and it sucks for people who had trusted Corey Davis and put him in your line because he gave you a goose egg yesterday. And then going on to the Ravens versus the Colts, the Ravens won this game 24-10, and this is a very interesting game because we just saw Philip Rivers go for 3 touchdown passes, a week before, to doing nothing this game. But the Ravens are a good defense, so I will give the Ravens the credit where credit is due. But is anyone else kind of concerned about Lamar Jackson? Because Lamar Jackson right now, he's not looking like the Lamar Jackson that we know of, that he's capable of. Like, MVP last year, blew up the league, exciting to watch, but all of a sudden it just seems like it's just not there right now. I don't get it. I don't understand if they don't have the offensive pieces around him. I don't know if there's just more tape on Lamar Jackson and the defense know how to play him, know how to scheme for him. But it just seems like Lamar Jackson is just not the guy that we had hoped. Now he does have a very favorable schedule going forward, but like even last year, it looked like Lamar Jackson was matchup proof regardless of who he played. And this year, I know the Colts have a good defense, but like it just seems like it's just not working for him this year. And he did have a rushing touchdown yesterday, so that matters, but just very interesting. And then when it comes to like Baltimore rushing, because I know there's a lot of questions between like, do I play J.K. Dobbins? Do I play Gus Edwards? Or do I play player X? And it's like, well, you want to play like everyone's leaning towards J.K. Dobbins because the week he had before, he had 113 yards on the ground last week. But this week, like you had Lamar Jackson have 13 carries, you had J.K. Dobbins have 12, and you had Gus Edwards have 11. The difference is between Edwards and Dobbins was the touchdown. Edwards got the touchdown. And this is why it's so hard to predict this backfield, because I think J.K. Dobbins is the better play, but it's all about situational football. And, Gus Edwards was getting the goal line back work, so he got the touchdown. So still very hard to determine who to play in this backfield. And what's interesting about on the other side of the ball with the Colts is that Jordan Wilkins had 11 carries, and we had Jonathan Taylor have 6. Now, Jonathan Taylor had the touchdown, but the bulk of the carries went to Jordan Wilkins. So very interesting to see that kind of take place when you have Jonathan Taylor. He's been dealing with the ankle injury, so I think a lot of that has to do with that. But still, you don't want if you're a fantasy owner of Jonathan Taylor, you don't want to see Jordan Wilkins getting the bulk of the carries. And then going on to the receivers, big news was that obviously Dez Bryant was activated from the practice squad for the Baltimore Ravens, and he did not record 1 target. So I'm not sure how many plays he played. I have to look that up, but Dez Bryant was not a factor at all yesterday. Marquise Brown, he was 3 for 38. And what's interesting about the Colts, so Michael Pittman Jr. came back from IR. He led the team with 7 targets. He was 4 for 56. So he's a guy to probably monitor if you need receiver help. He'll be mentioned on the waiver wire show tomorrow, but I think that if you're really looking for help, he could be a possible candidate to add to your roster. So very interesting to see that, because obviously T.Y. Hilton was inactive yesterday. And then going on to tight end, obviously, everyone was like Trey Burton, Jack Doyle, Mo Cox, like these are good, pickups. If you listen to my matchup show and my starts and sits, I didn't want to play any of these Colts tight ends because you can't determine, just like the Ravens backfield, you can't determine who's going to be the guy who's going to play. So I was like, if I had to lean towards anybody, it was going to be Trey Burton. But then you see that Mo Cox, he was 3 for 43, and you had Trey Burton, who was 1 for 6. And then Jack Doyle, who left the game early with a concussion. So just an overall hard game to figure out of like who to play from a tight end standpoint, because I do think that the upside goes to Trey Burton still, but still not a tight end position I want to mess with on that team. And moving on to the Chiefs versus the Panthers. Chiefs won this game 33-31. Pretty close game overall. You had a good game from Teddy Bridgewater. He had 2 touchdowns. Patrick Mahomes was Patrick Mahomes. He had 4 touchdowns. Christian McCaffrey showed no rust. He had like 37 PPR points yesterday. So, 18 carries for 69 yards and a touchdown. He had another 10 catches for 82 yards with 10 targets and a touchdown. So, Christian McCaffrey is a monster, and he is fun to watch. And it sucks that he injured himself, because he's a guy that I think that the NFL needs to have, just because of the plays that he makes. And then Curtis Samuel, not a bad game for him. Like I said, he was 9 for 105 and a touchdown. And then he had another 3 rushes for 13 yards. So very, dynamic in the sense of how they're using him. And then on the Chiefs side of the ball, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he only had 5 carries for 14 yards. So this is not good for you if you're a Clyde Edwards-Helaire owner, because Le'Veon Bell, even though he only had 4 carries, I don't know. It was a passing day for the Chiefs yesterday, so a lot of times game script and the way they have game planned for the Panthers determines what the players' their outlook could be. But Clyde Edwards-Helaire, just not another good fancy outing. Big game from Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill had 18 targets yesterday. That is crazy. And then Travis Kelce had 12. Both had over 100 yards. Tyreek Hill had the 2 touchdowns, so good for him. And then going back to the Carolina Panthers, like I was talking about earlier, like Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore. Robbie Anderson had 13 targets. He was 9 for 63, so not awful. But DJ Moore, 2 for 18 on 3 targets. So they completely just shut out DJ Moore yesterday. So just not something that you would expect from a guy who is considered their number 1. But I think Robbie Anderson continues to outshine DJ Moore this year. And then going on to the Vikings versus the Lions. This was another Dalvin Cook just dominant game. The Vikings won this 34-20, but Matthew Stafford didn't have a good game. He had 2 interceptions and a touchdown. Now he got knocked out of the game early, so Chase Daniels came in. He had a touchdown and an interception. Kirk Cousins, he had 3 touchdowns, so not a bad game from him. But it's just one of those things where, this offense is ran through Dalvin Cook, and Dalvin Cook had over 200 yards rushing. He had 2 touchdowns. Man, this guy is just on fire right now. I love watching this guy play. On the Detroit Lions side of the ball, DeAndre Swift, he had 13 carries for 64 yards. So he was a guy that we weren't sure if he was going to get the workload, because last week was kind of hit or miss. This week he has 13 carries. Didn't do terrible, but not something you want to see from somebody who has the bulk of the carries. Adrian Peterson had 8 carries for 29 yards. And I wonder what Adrian Peterson's looking at when he sees a guy like Dalvin Cook on the other side of the ball on the team that he used to play for, just dominate like that. It's like what Adrian Peterson was compared to what Dalvin Cook is now, and it's just crazy. I just wonder what he thinks when he's just watching this guy just torch them. And then on the receiving side of the ball, so we know that Kenny Golladay was out, and we just wonder kind of how Marvin Jones was going to take that role, because he would be the number 1 wide receiver. And then you saw what happened yesterday. He was 3 for 43, had a touchdown, so not awful if you started Marvin Jones. But then you got Danny Amendola. Sorry, he had 7 receptions for 77 yards and on 10 targets. So crazy to think that Danny Amendola was going to have the majority of the targets when you have Marvin Jones, T.J. Hawkinson. So very interesting there. Marvin Hall was another guy that could have been added last week in the waiver wires, and he only had 3 for 28, so a very quiet game for him. For Minnesota, Justin Jefferson, he was 3 for 64. He only had 4 targets, but he did lead the Minnesota Vikings on touchdown or on targets and yardage. Adam Thielen, very quiet game. He was 2 for 30 on 5 targets, so not very good for him. And then what's surprising to me is that the 2 guys who had receiving touchdowns, there's 3 touchdowns. Amir Abdullah had a touchdown, right? He had one reception. He had a screen pass that he went in for a touchdown. He played against the Lions. It was crazy to kind of see that you had, Adrian Peterson, who used to play for the Vikings, on the Lions Then you had a guy that was on the Lions and Amir Abdullah on the Vikings. It was pretty funny to see that. And then Irv Smith Jr., the tight end, had 2 touchdowns on 2 catches. So no one's going to be able to predict that. But from a fantasy standpoint, good for him. But overall, like I said, the story of this game was Dalvin Cook. It continues to just be the guy that hopefully you own in fantasy and you're not going against. And then going on to the Washington football team versus the Giants. The Giants won this game in an ugly game, 23-20. Really not a lot to talk about this game. Alex Smith came in after Kyle Allen went down with an ankle injury. He had a touchdown. Wayne Gallman, he had 14 carries and a touchdown. Terry McLaurin, 7 receptions for 115 yards and a touchdown. So good game from him. What was interesting about the Washington football team, right? Antonio Gibson is a guy that he's the starter. He's a rookie. He has kind of gotten into that role of being the starter. But then you look at what J.D. McKissic did yesterday. He had 14 targets yesterday. So, I just don't understand because Antonio Gibson can be that guy. So I don't understand why J.D. McKissic is the guy that they're used. I don't know. It's just hard to figure out why they're doing that. But if you're a Washington fan and you can tell me why they're distributing the ball like that, please leave a comment below because I'm just not sure why I feel like Gibson is the better talent. But then you get McKissic having 14 targets. So overall, this was just a very, very ugly game. If you're a guy who played Darius Slayton, you're very disappointed because Darius Slayton only had, he had 1 target for 6 yards, and then a guy named Austin Mack. I have never heard of Austin Mack before, but he got called up, 4 receptions for 72 yards on 5 targets. Evan Ingram had a good game. He was 5 for 48 and a touchdown on 10 targets. Sterling Shepard, he was 6 for 39, but just very interesting just to see how kind of this game was kind of bizarre, based on just kind of how things are going back and forth. And then going on to the Texans versus the Jaguars. Now, this was a very interesting game because we had no idea how Jake Luton's going to be when it comes to, he's a rookie. No one really knows much about him. He's a big, tall quarterback, but we had no idea what his putting his outing will be against the Texans. Now, the Texans are a good defense to go against because they do give up a lot of yards. But overall, he had a good game. Jake Luton had 304 yards passing, he had a touchdown. He did do an interception. He did have a rushing touchdown. So if you took the risk and played him, you were happy because he did well for you yesterday. Deshaun Watson, he had 2 touchdowns. James Robinson, he had 25 carries for 99 yards and a touchdown. So he continues to be the go-to guy when it comes to that team. Now, he's not in there when it comes to 2-minute drills and all that stuff. They usually put Chris Thompson in there. Chris Thompson had 4 receptions for 35 yards. What's nice about this, though, that DJ Chark, he had 7 receptions for 146 yards and a touchdown on 12 targets. So a lot of people were concerned about him because we weren't sure how he was going to be going forward because he was dealing with injuries. Then you had Laviska Shenault. He was a guy that was taking targets away. He didn't play yesterday. And then you have Keelan Cole. So a lot of these guys just didn't do what they're supposed to do. And DJ Chark got the majority of the work yesterday. So good for him. Good game from him. On the Texans side of the ball, Will Fuller, he had 5 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown on 5 targets. Brandon Cooks, another good game. He had 3 receptions for 83 yards and a touchdown. So these are 2 guys that, a lot of people dropped Brandon Cooks. And if you stayed with it, you're starting to see that benefit. So hopefully you're a guy that kept on Cooks. And I think he's a good flex play. I think he's a guy that if you're in a deeper league, you can play in the flex. Or if you're playing in a 3-receiver league, you can play him. Because he shows consistency throughout the last few games. So I think he's a safe guy to play going forward. But David Johnson in this game, he left the game early with a concussion, so Duke Johnson had to come in, so he got a touchdown yesterday. But I do think that you got to monitor what's going on with David Johnson because Duke Johnson may be a guy that you may have to add if you need a running back, if you're a David Johnson owner and there's really nobody left on your waiver wire that you can pick up for a running back. So now I'm going to go on to the Raiders versus the Chargers, and this is a frustrating thing because I think as a Chargers fan, if you are a Chargers fan, you have to be frustrated on this because they find different ways to lose. And that game was so exciting to watch at the very end where they almost had a touchdown pass that was called a touchdown, but then got overruled and overturned, and then it was considered a drop. But man, Justin Herbert continues to look like a star. He had another 300-yard game with 2 touchdown passes. He had another 5 rushes from 24 yards. So this guy has been one of the big surprises in fantasy and from the rookie class. So, like, this guy continues to just look great. Derek Carr had a good game. He had another 2 touchdown passes. And when it comes to like the rushing, we all know that Josh Jacobs was dealing with the knee ailment. He did have 14 carries, but he only had 65 yards and a touchdown. So since he scored that touchdown, it wasn't an awful game for you. But they used Devontae Booker a lot because I think Josh Jacobs just couldn't handle all the workload yesterday. What's interesting about the Chargers side of the ball, Kalen Ballage was the one who carried the ball 15 times for 69 yards and a touchdown. No, Justin Jackson, he went out early because of a knee injury. Then Joshua Kelly was the guy that we assumed that would be the starter. Or he was, I'm sorry, not the starter, but he was the guy that you thought would get the majority of the carries once Justin Jackson went down. But then here comes Kalen Ballage coming in and being the leader in that backfield. So a very interesting day for the rushing, for the Chargers. But hey, he produced, so you can't be mad about that. But nobody played Ballage, obviously. I had no idea he was even on the Chargers, to be honest with you. And then going on to the wide receivers, Hunter Renfrow, he led the Raiders with 2 receptions for 60 yards. Overall, just kind of a weird game from the receivers. But Nelson Aguilar is the one who had the touchdown. Darren Waller had a touchdown. Darren Waller had 10 targets, so Darren Waller continues to be a safe option at the tight end position. And on the Charger side of the ball, Keenan Allen continues to be just a target monster. 9 receptions for 103 yards and a touchdown. He had 11 targets. Mike Williams had a good game. He was 5 for 81 on 7 targets. I think he continues to be a good play just because he is that big physical wide receiver that will majority of the time win those 50-50 balls. I mean, Mike Williams continues to be a guy that I'm sure is on your waiver wire. And I'm not sure why, because he definitely is talented. So hopefully he will be owned in a lot of leagues after this week and going forward, because he definitely he's a good asset to have. And then a couple names here. Hunter Henry, he was 4 for 33, so not awful if you're in PPR leagues. Let's see, Henry Ruggs, 3 targets, 0 receptions. So just, overall, just kind of, other than like kind of the Charger side of the ball, not really much going on with the Raiders when it comes to fantasy. Now moving on to the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Steelers won this game and stay undefeated. They won 24-19. Big game from Big Ben. He had over 300 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. Now, there was concern for him in the first half of this game. Steelers' offense just looked stagnant. Didn't look like they could get anything done on the Cowboys. And then Big Ben goes down with a knee injury. He's able to throw a touchdown pass before the half. He went into the locker room and got some imaging done. He probably got some type of injection. Came back in the second half, had a very good second half. It looks like he has some type of MCL injury. However, he has said in his interviews that he's not going to miss any time. But hopefully that will be the case, because the Steelers definitely need him for the offense to continue to do what they're doing. And then on the Dallas side of the ball, I mean, they went with Garrett Gilbert this game. Not bad for a guy who has not played in an NFL game. And honestly, for him to throw a touchdown against this team, he looked a lot better than Ben DiNucci did. And I would argue he looked better than Andy Dalton, to be honest with you. I think that if you're a Cowboys owner, in a sense of like if you own Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, and CeeDee Lamb, you're very encouraged on what you saw with this, because he was distributing the ball to everyone evenly. I don't think that when you saw what happened with Ben DiNucci, he was targeting Michael Gallup a lot. Like, he locked in on one guy. And I think with Garrett Gilbert, against this defense, he was able to find multiple guys. So I think that's encouraging. But when it comes to... just talking about the receivers real quick for Dallas. I mean, CeeDee Lamb led the team with 4 receptions for 71 yards and a touchdown. Now, he was the only receiver who had a touchdown, but look at the targets. CeeDee Lamb had 7 targets. Amari Cooper had 6. Dalton Schultz had 7. Michael Gallup had 7. So that's encouraging that you're seeing him distribute the ball that way, where the guys that we have on our fantasy rosters, you have kind of a sign of relief, like, okay, I don't need to drop these guys, because CeeDee Lamb to me was getting to the point where I was going to drop him on my own roster, because I'm like, I can't have a guy just take up a roster spot that's not gaining any fantasy production. So now he makes me want to keep him for another week to see if that's consistent, if Gilbert is going to play. But just encouraging. And then seeing like what happened with the wide receivers for Pittsburgh, right? This should have been a game that you could have played any Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver, because they all could have had decent games, and they did. So Juju had 6. He was 6 for 93 in a touchdown on 7 targets. Deontay Johnson, he was 6 for 77 on 10 targets. Chase Claypool was 8 for 69 on 13 targets. Eric Ebron, he had a touchdown. James Washington had a touchdown. So overall, pretty good outing for any receiver that you had played for the Steelers. But going to the rushing, like James Conner, bad game from him. He was 9 for 22. Ezekiel Elliott, he had 18 carries for 51 yards. He was not slated to play. He was dealing with a hamstring injury, but he decided to test his hamstring out pregame. He felt pretty good, so he played. But honestly, just very ineffective. But overall, the Cowboys, they hung in there against a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers, but they unfortunately could not, get the win. So Steelers improved to 8-0. And the last game to recap was the Dolphins versus the Cardinals. So Dolphins won this game 34-31. Very surprising because this was a home game for the Cardinals, and it was a back and forth game, all game long. And it was fun to watch. One of probably the better games to watch of the year. And it was fun to see Tua actually, like last week we saw Tua not do very well against the Rams, which obviously was his first NFL start. But you saw what he did yesterday, and it's encouraging. I mean, he had 2 touchdown passes. He looked a lot more comfortable. He was able to, to make good decisions. So, I don't know. I mean, Tua could be the future of Miami. That definitely is an encouraging sign based on how he played. Kyler Murray, man, this guy is just ridiculous. This guy had another, 3 touchdowns passing, had another rushing touchdown, he had 106 yards rushing, which, I mean, this guy is crazy. Like, I was talking to a friend about this morning. We're talking about, like, you look at Lamar Jackson, you look at Kyler Murray, and you look at, obviously Lamar Jackson won the MVP last year, but Kyler Murray, there's a lot of film on Kyler Murray, right? Just that it is on Lamar Jackson, but Kyler Murray continues to do what he did last year. And I think that's the difference between, I'm not saying that Kyler Murray is an overall better quarterback than Lamar Jackson, but if you look at how both are playing this year, I mean, Kyler Murray looks like a lot better than Lamar Jackson. I mean, it is just crazy to see. And I think Kyler Murray's a better passer, but he continues to dominate. And the Miami Dolphins don't have a bad defense, so it's crazy to see how Kyler Murray continues to put up points. He is a quarterback and a running back in one player, and that's what Lamar Jackson was last year. But everything's falling the right way for Kyler Murray, but it's not going the right way for Lamar Jackson. So that's the biggest difference. But it's just crazy to see how there's enough film to scheme against Kyler Murray, just that there is a bit into Lamar Jackson, but Kyler Murray continues to be that guy that's shining over for Lamar Jackson. So pretty interesting. And when it comes to because we knew that Kenyon Drake was going to be out for this game, so we saw that Chase Edmonds was going to be the guy. He had 25 carries for 70 yards. He didn't score, but what else can you want? I mean, this is a guy that you had to plug and play because if you had Kenyon Drake, you needed a running back. You know that he was going to get the workload. So 25 carries is a pretty good day. And then for the Dolphins side of the ball, Jordan Howard was the guy that got 10 carries. We had 10 carries for 19 yards and a touchdown, so it didn't kill you if you had to start him just because you got the touchdown. But, they distributed the ball. They had Salvin Ahmed. He had 7 carries. Tua had 7 carries. So they just didn't lock and load on one guy. They distributed the ball rushing. And then at the wide receiver position, Christian Kirk, huge game for Christian Kirk. 5 for 123 and a touchdown and 8 targets. DeAndre Hopkins was pretty quiet. He was 3 for 30, which is very surprising to see a guy of that magnitude have such a game that was very ineffective. On the Dolphins side of the ball, Devontae Parker, he was 6 for 64 on 7 targets. Preston Williams had a good game. He was 4 for 60 and a touchdown. However, he left the game early with a foot sprain. Looks like he's going to be out for some time. So it just, sucks for him. And then Mike Gesicki, 3 for 42. So not a bad game from a tight end position. But overall, I mean, this was a fun game to watch. I mean, the Dolphins defense, even though they gave up a lot of points, they had a defensive score. So definitely a decent game from the Dolphins. They're a team that they're 5-3 right now, and the Bills, I mean, it could be anyone's game in that AFC East. So it looks pretty good for the Dolphins going forward. But that's my reaction to all of the games for Week 9. Now moving on to the studs of the week, starting at the quarterback position. The number 1 quarterback in fantasy this week was Kyler Murray. He had 43.51 fantasy points. Second was Josh Allen with 41.5. And then Patrick Mahomes was third with 38.94. And then going on to the running back position, for the second week in a row, Dalvin Cook leads the running backs with 39.2 PPR points. Christian McCaffrey was at 37.1. And J.D. McKissick was 17.2. So if you look at just the running back position as a whole, because I'm going to give you an honorable mention, Kalen Ballage was fourth best fantasy running back at 16.4. Just let that sink in. You have Dalvin Cook and Christian McCaffrey almost scoring 40 points. And then there's a huge gap to third, where the third best fantasy point from a PPR standpoint was J.D. McKissick with 17.2. Then you had Kalen Ballage fourth overall at 16.4. Like, that's how ugly the running backs were this week when it comes to fantasy points. I mean, that's a huge difference, because usually you'll see like someone in the 30s, then you see somebody in the low 30s, then you see the high 20s, and kind of like incrementally go down like that. But that was a huge gap between Dalvin Cook and the third best running back for the week. So I just added Kalen Ballage. So I thought that was an interesting guy to be fourth overall. And then he had a better outing than Alvin Kamara, so that was crazy. And then at wide receiver, going back to the Thursday Night Football game, Richie James Jr. of the 49ers, he led all wide receivers with 33.4 PPR points. Devontae Adams was second with 33.3, and then Tyreek Hill was third with 33.1. And then going on to the tight end position, Travis Kelce, once again, tears it up. He was at 25.9 PPR points. Jimmy Graham was second at 17.5, and then Evan Ingram was third at 15.8. So those are your fantasy studs for Week 9. Don't forget, we do have a game tonight, the Patriots versus the Jets. Hopefully, I always ask the question, who do you have playing tonight that would help you win? And it looks like whoever's playing tonight, hopefully you're not relying on them to win your game. Hopefully you already have your game already won or lost. We're at a point where whoever you're playing this game tonight is not going to matter. I already won my matchup for this week, but I do have Sam Darnold as my backup quarterback because Joe Burrow is on a bye week, and we play a 2-quarterback league, so I had to pick up Joe Flacco. So I have Joe Flacco playing, and I have the Patriots defense. So I already won the matchup, so I really don't need anything else to win. But if you do have somebody that you need to help you win, leave a comment below, because I'm wondering what you guys are relying on this game tonight to see who's going to help you win your fantasy week, because not a lot of options. I mean, it's going to be I think it's going to be a very ugly Monday night game, but it's still football. We still get to watch football, so it's going to be, at least that's the positive from it. But that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you for watching us on YouTube as well. If you have any fantasy football questions, please feel free to leave a comment below or email us at chip@gridironfantasyfootball.com. I try to be very quick to answer any questions you may have, but also, if you'd like to follow us on social media, we're at the Gridiron Pod on Twitter and Facebook. We're on Instagram at Gridiron Fantasy Football. So don't forget to hit subscribe on YouTube or on the podcast so you don't miss any more episodes, because tomorrow's episode, I'm going to go over all the waiver wire pickups, all my top waiver wire pickups for Week 10. So tune in for that for tomorrow. But that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Take care.